All right, guys, as you all know, we just finished up with our post-war / Cold War foreign unit, which was, we took a look at basically everything that was going on all around the world following World War II. And then as you can see here, it says post-war world, the domestic perspective. So this is, again, it says post-war, and we use that term because that's what it says in the textbook, but it's really the Cold War. So, again, Cold War, the domestic perspective. When you see that word domestic, that means what's happening here within our own borders in the United States. So I know in the previous unit we did touch upon some things that were happening here in the United States, but like I said, it was more of a globally sort of focused unit, whereas this one's going to focus more specifically on the United States and what exactly was happening here within our own borders following World War II. And so you can see here it says White House announces the war is over. And so I'm not going to read through this quote, but, obviously I mentioned this before about the next 4 or 5 units that we're going to do are all going to pertain to things that were a part of the Cold War. And so problems with demobilization, so post-war measures. And it says here, many Americans felt that the United States would fall back into a recession or a depression, just like after World War I. So obviously, if you guys think back to earlier in the year, we learned about the Great Depression, and then essentially we went from World War I into the Roaring '20s and then into the Great Depression. And then as we've discussed before, World War II was what was going to pull us out of the Depression. It stimulated the economy. It provided a lot of people with jobs. Millions of young men had to go overseas and serve. I mean, even here in our own nation, there were a lot of people that were put to work to support the war effort. So, it made sense that when the war ended, a lot of people were worried that, just like the war pulled us out of the Depression, now the war's over, we're going to fall back into a depression. And so the government was taking measures to try and prevent that from happening. And that was a legitimate fear. So the GI Bill of Rights was created. And again, it provided pensions and government loans to help veterans start businesses, buy homes or farms, or go to college. So this was a program that was initiated to, just like it says, help these veterans that are coming back from the war kind of get their life going. And it's changed throughout the years. I was speaking with a guy the other day who actually served in the Army at the end of the Vietnam era, and I think he told me that he used his GI Bill to buy his home. So, initially when the GI Bill was first created, people were using it for things like homes and businesses and things like that. When I got the GI Bill, it was more of people used it for school, paying for college or tech school or whatever. So again, but this is just a chart here kind of showing you how it's changed throughout the years, old GI Bill, new GI Bill. So after 9/11, they sort of changed the GI Bill again and actually improved it a lot. Again, so you can see here, just looking at this chart, the new GI Bill after 9/11 basically pays full tuition. And there's just, they've added a lot of benefits and a lot of perks to the GI Bill since 9/11, so it's even better now. I was pre 9/11. I got out in 2001. That was when 9/11 happened, but I got out a couple months before 9/11, so I had the old GI Bill. And I think maybe I told some of you guys this before, but when I got the GI Bill, essentially the way that it worked for me was at the beginning of every month, I would call an 1-800 number. So you would just dial a toll-free number. It would say press 1 if you're still fully enrolled in college. So you're just verifying that you're still in school. It's not like you quit school and then you're still getting money as if you're going. And then, obviously they can't give you the money if you're not in school. So you would just verify by pressing 1. And about a week later, I would get a check from the government for about $1,000 or so. And they just mailed you the check. And then you took that $1,000 and you're supposed to put it towards school, but you didn't have to put it towards school. But I used it to pay my rent, my car insurance, my cell phone bill. I was using it to kind of live off of. So, when I got out of college, I still had a couple $1,000s worth of loans, but it paid for most of it for me. But like I said, this new GI Bill that's been implemented since 9/11, it's even better because it just pays 100% tuition, but you still get money on top of that. So, obviously I've talked about the military quite a bit this year, and I always say I don't tell everyone they should join the military. I don't think it is for everyone, but it's definitely, if you're someone who's considering it or think that might be something you'd want to do, there's so many benefits you get out of it. I mean, you give up well, it depends, but I gave up 4 years of my life. The Air Force minimum was 4 years, but I think the Navy has 2-year enlistments. I think the Army has 3-year enlistments, so it varies. But for me, you gave them 4 years of your life, and they give you a lot back, because that is a lot of your life. You think about it, 4 years of your life, you're in high school for 4 years, 9 through 12. So you're giving them that same amount of time after you graduate high school. And so therefore they're going to make it worth your time. They're going to pay you. And like I said, even things that you're not thinking about it, as a teenager, like when you buy a house or when you're trying to get a job or whatever, like, all those different things that are going to come into your life further down the road. Being a veteran can help you with all that stuff. I remember when I bought my house, there was a $10,000 fee that was waived because I was a veteran. So there's $10,000 I saved buying a house just because I was a veteran. Even getting a job, that's one of the reasons I got hired, was because they saw that on my resume. Oh, you're a veteran. When you've been in the military and you have an honorable discharge, they know that there's certain characteristics that you possess, such as responsibility and things of that nature. So, it speaks volumes about a person when they've successfully completed a military enlistment. And so, again, if you're going to be a police officer, you get added points onto your test. You have to take a test to be a police officer, and so you get additional points if you're a veteran, things of that nature. So I won't go on about this, but if anybody wants to learn more, I can talk about it. So problems for workers again. So as veterans came home, they took work from African Americans and women who had filled those roles while the millions of soldiers were off fighting. Women were asked to return to being homemakers, and some women did not like this at all, and we're going to see this in the rise of the feminist movement. Workers were also concerned with inflation, which would mean the cost of goods soared, after the war was over. Labor unrest, 1946. Remember, the war ended in 1945. So in 1946, almost 5 million workers walked picket lines in anticipation of striking. President Truman supported the unions, but not striking or at the expense of the economy, because the president, voiced, like it says, support for these unions, these workers' unions, but he didn't want them to strike because he was concerned about the economy going under again. And so the Taft-Hartley Act was passed. Like it says here, a Republican-controlled Congress basically outlawed closed shop agreements and strikes. So without getting into this too much, basically a closed shop agreement was there were certain deals being made with various industries and jobs where you had to be a member of the union to get a job, and so they sort of outlawed that. That's what that means. You can't make it a requirement to be part of a union in order to hire people, and so that's what they were trying to kind of do against. But like it says here, labor unions called it the slave labor bill. Again, it's just a matter of the government trying to sort of control whether or not people can belong to labor unions. And so the election of 1948, the Committee on Civil Rights was formed in December of 1946. And basically, like it says here, Truman established a committee to examine racial issues in the United States. The committee's findings were entitled to secure these rights and documented that there were widespread civil rights abuses taking place across the country. So Truman urged Congress to pass anti-lynching laws and anti-poll tax measures. He also worked to end discrimination in federal agencies and in the military. So what you're seeing here are some of the early stages of the civil rights movement, and we'll get into the civil rights movement. It really took off and gained a lot of momentum in the 1960s. So that the civil rights movement will have its own unit. But what you're seeing here are some of the early stages that would lead into the civil rights movement. So the government was taking measures to try and end any sort of inequality or racial discrimination that was found to be occurring in the United States. So you're starting to see progress in that direction as far as, making sure that people's civil rights are being upheld and honored. And like you see here, the headline says, President Truman wipes out segregation in the armed forces. So the military was one of the first government, agencies to be desegregated. So that's kind of where we start to see this movement towards desegregation in the country. And it's, like I said, it started with the military. So the Democratic Convention, Truman received the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 1948 despite Southern opposition. His platform, or his sort of goal, was to repeal of the Taft-Hartley Act, which I just mentioned, broader Social Security benefits, and an increase in federal aid for housing, education, and agriculture. Southern Democrats stormed out of the convention and formed the States' Rights Party, nicknamed the Dixiecrats. Strom Thurmond was a Carolina governor who was nominated as their candidate. And you can see here on this chart here, it says split, meaning that the party was split. When you split a party, whether it be Democrats or Republicans, but maybe you have a sort of like a conflict within the party, and then they kind of split up and run two separate candidates, it's usually seen as a disadvantage, because what you're doing is you're sort of, if you're splitting, let's say the Democrats split their votes and the Republicans stay unified, now the Republicans are going to have more votes because they're going to have more people voting for one person rather than being split on a number of people. This is Truman speaking at the convention. Truman on his presidential tour. A lot of times, presidential candidates still do this. It's just now they fly. Back in the day, they used to use trains. It's before commercial air travel really became popular and widespread. So like it says here, the gulf widens. There was another break in the Democratic Party. So we had the initial split in the Democratic Party. Now we have another split. Henry Wallace and other liberal New Deal dealers found a new progressive party they called for an extension of the New Deal that was started in the 1930s by FDR. So now the Democratic Party is split again, and it says now they're definitely going to lose. So Republican victory. Republicans nominated Thomas Dewey, and with the Democratic vote split three ways, they felt that victory would be easy in 1948. So basically, they're like, it's a done deal. Republicans are going to win. Democrats are split three ways. So famously, the headlines read, Dewey defeats Truman. Like it says here, you see this President Truman holding up a newspaper and sort of laughing because, like it says here, however, Truman won the election with 303 electoral votes to 189 given to Dewey. Dewey defeats Truman was published in the newspapers because they were so certain that Dewey was going to defeat Truman that they printed the headlines before the results of the election were even in. So Truman's kind of laughing and saying, they didn't think I could win, but they were wrong. That's a famous picture. It's in a lot of history books. So here you see the outcome of the election. Truman wins. That's Truman when he was in World War I. Truman talking to FDR before he died. Truman was the vice president at this point. Truman being sworn in. Truman shaking hands with some veterans. Truman and his wife. So Truman's program for the presidency was called the Fair Deal. And the Fair Deal included full unemployment, a higher minimum wage, a national health insurance program, construction of affordable housing, increased aid to farmers, and the expansion of welfare benefits to more people. Most Republicans and Democrats opposed the Fair Deal, but despite opposition, Truman managed to push through some of his reform. And, I think I maybe mentioned this before, but what's kind of interesting is, again, we're talking, 1948 here. So it's a long time ago, but a lot of times you look at Democrat and Republican platforms or plans, even still today, and they still kind of resemble, the Republican and Democrat plans from, decades back. So it's kind of interesting that they still uphold those same sort of goals and things like that. But every president kind of has like a plan for what he wants to do. They used to give them names. I don't know if they do that anymore. I really don't hear anything about it, but the Fair Deal is the name that Truman used. So The Affluent Society was a book that outlined the manner in which the post-World War II America was becoming wealthy in the private sector but remained poor in the public sector. U.S. lacked social and physical infrastructure. The wealth gap was increasing, and this sparked much public discussion. So essentially what they're saying is the difference between rich and poor is kind of growing at this point. That's what this book was all about. So here we have the draft Eisenhower campaign. Many Americans felt the country needed Eisenhower in charge. He was a war hero. He was a proven leader. He got us, he was a big player in World War II. He was the head of NATO at one point. And so a lot of Republicans said, we need this guy to run the country. He did a good job as a military commander. Let's put him in the White House, the Oval Office, and we think he'll do a great job for the United States as well. So like you see here, his slogan was, I like Ike. Just some campaign buttons. I like Ike. I like Ike. Ike is short for Eisenhower. They just, it's just, his campaign tour. So the Eisenhower era, Americans in 1952 elected Dwight D. Eisenhower as president to boost the economy, curb what he called creeping socialism of the New Deal, and to balance the budget and reduce government influence in the economy. Modern Republicans were conservative when it came to money and liberal when it came to human rights. And under Eisenhower, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare was created. 34th President of the United States. So the economy, the workplace was changing. As you can see here, it says automation was when machines were performing industrial operations. So machines are sort of starting to replace human labor. Obviously we still see that today as technology continues to evolve. But this reduced the number of blue-collar workers. Blue collars meaning like manufacturing, factory-type workers, construction workers. So the new union style, there was a merger of American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organization. In 1956, 18.5 million union members were in the United States. The union support did decline, however, as a result of a link to organized crime. So the mafia was getting involved in union activity, basically. So that kind of scared a lot of people off. They didn't want to get involved with anything that had to do with the mafia or organized crime. So suburban migration in the 1960s, 60 million Americans, 1/3 of the U.S. population lived in suburbs or the outskirts of the city. Essentially, probably what we would know as developments is what you start to see kind of popping up. So the Highway Act of 1956 greatly expanded the highway system. And you can see here a lot of these towns started popping up around the country. Levittown. There's a number of Levitt towns because, so you can see here in this headline, Levitt plans low-priced homes suitable for any wage earner. So Levitt was the guy who kind of had this plan to create homes that were sort of like pre-manufactured. So up here in this picture, you can see there's 4 houses. So these were the 4 models that you could pick from. So you would just choose one of these models and they could kind of throw it up really quick and do it for pretty low cost. And then everybody was able to have like a decent home. I mean, we're not living in mansions here, but they were good. They're good enough. And so, like I said, you still kind of see this with developments today, like a townhome. They're all the same. So, and that makes it easier for manufacturers. You're not building all sorts of different houses with different designs. It's all just a straightforward, and that allows them to kind of put them up faster and they can sell them for lower cost. So our interstate system was also built at this time under Eisenhower. And you can see here, this is actually a picture of the Autobahn. The Autobahn is the interstate of Europe. And Eisenhower, as we know, he served in Europe during World War II, and he saw the Autobahn, which was created by Hitler to move military personnel and supplies. And so Eisenhower came back and said, we need to do the same thing, because if we ever go to war and we need to move military supplies or people, we need to have a road system that will allow us to do that quickly and efficiently. So that's the whole purpose of the interstate. Now, obviously, we know that here you can see these guys were the engineers behind the creation of the interstate system, 1956. So, but like I said, we all use the interstate now to travel and stuff. So it is used for civilian, commercial use, transport. But the original purpose was military. And, I think I've mentioned this to you guys before, but I'll say it again because one thing you have to remember is, World War II ended in 1945. Korea started and ended shortly after. And in the back of people's minds, people just were expecting World War III or another big conflict to start any day, because today we haven't been in any real major wars, and wars really aren't at the forefront of our minds at the time. We're not really thinking about war, but you have to remember, like, just coming out of these major large-scale conflicts, people were just, that's where their heads were, was that this is going to happen again. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen this, but when you look at the interstate system, the highways that go east and west are even, and the ones that go north and south are odd. So you can see here, get up here to, where's it at? Interstate 80 runs through, basically you can get on that pretty easily from here, and it'll run the whole way to California. So, but obviously it was a huge undertaking, building these highways, just the amount of concrete and planning, but obviously they've helped us out a lot. So suburban life, there was a baby boom after World War II. So like it says here, after World War II, there was a soaring birth rate. Some 30 million people in the U.S. were born, a good percentage of the U.S. population. This was the largest generation ever up to this point. How I think we've talked about this before, they give different generations names. You guys are, I believe, Gen Z. And so before you guys were the millennials. I think the millennials may have been bigger than the baby boomers. I'd have to double check that. But, regardless, the baby boom generation was huge. And that's because you had all these soldiers coming back from war. They haven't seen their significant others in a number of months, maybe years. And, I don't need to get into a health lesson on this, but a lot of babies were born. So we had an explosion in U.S. population at that time.
A video about millennials and another about Generation X, I've gotten a lot of comments asking why we divide people into generational groups at all. How is a boomer born in 1946 attributed the same generational characteristics as a boomer born in 1964? That's a fair question. Let's get into it. You're watching Future Now, videos about the future of tech and society. As in my previous video on this topic, I want to be clear that I'm speaking from an American perspective, because as you'll see, generational breakdowns are very much influenced by culture, and thus different regions of the world that have different lived experiences will not have the same names for social generations. There are names for generations going back further than the baby boomers, such as the greatest generation who fought in World War II and grew up during the Great Depression, and the silent generation, which followed. But all of the generations before the baby boomers were actually named retroactively, because boomers kicked off this whole naming of generations trend. Following World War II, there was a boom in the birth rate, as Americans felt confident that the newly strong economy would allow them to raise multiple children, and suddenly demographers, economists, and advertisers felt a need to label this group to better understand them. Why? Because such a big spike in babies would continue to have ripple effects across the economy, society, and culture of the country for years to come. Every major milestone this group reached had big implications. For example, when boomers started reaching car buying age, suddenly car sales would go up. When they were of age to attend college, enrollment would skyrocket. And of course, eventually boomers became the largest voting bloc, and therefore dictated much of government policy. According to William Strauss and Neil Howe's generational theory, there's a new generation of people every 20 or so years that create a new social, political, and economic climate, and they're tied together by three key markers. One, their relative age during a major moment in history and the social trends during that time. Two, the beliefs and behaviors they share by virtue of being raised around the same time. And three, their buy-in to being a part of their generation by being aware of commonalities shared with people in their group. It's much easier to study and follow trends in a group of people if you're able to label them, especially if you're an ad agency, which arguably are the main force behind the naming of generations. In fact, you can find several tips online for generational marketing. The main reason for this is that it works. As much as many people don't want to believe that ads targeted at them because of their age are effective, more often than not, they are, and were particularly useful before the rise of big data, in which companies can now micro-target individuals through Facebook, Instagram, and, well, YouTube. By focusing on an age group, market researchers can do cohort analyses, meaning following a group and their change in behavior and opinions through their life cycle. That way, researchers can differentiate what a particular generation thought and how they behaved in their youth versus how they think and behave in adulthood, and can also compare this to other generations at those stages. So basically, we have to deal with a constant barrage of noise about baby boomers, millennials, and Gen Zers so that companies can produce better targeted Instagram ads for their terrible smartphone games. But Strauss and Howe's generational theory goes even further than that. They claim that generations follow a cycle of 4 distinct eras. The high, in which institutions are strong and individualism is weak, and so society generally agrees on the direction they're heading in. This is followed by the awakening, wherein people wake up and realize that actually institutions are kind of terrible, and they want to take back their independence. Then comes the unraveling, when institutions are heavily weakened and individualism is soaring as people enjoy their newfound autonomy, which ultimately leads to the crisis, which is a time of war and revolution leading to creation of new institutions built on the values of the generation currently in power. If the baby boomers were at the high in the so-called golden age of capitalism, Generation X rebelled during their awakening. Millennials fully embraced their individualism and grew up in the midst of growing culture war during the unraveling. Then we are now in the crisis era. As public sentiment is more divided than it has been in a long time, confidence in institutions like the White House and Congress are at an all-time low, and we're beginning to seriously contend with the consequences of climate change. I suppose by this theory, though, we're due for a new high and a reboot for the cycle in the next decade, presuming we can make it through the crisis and get back on track. Despite the sort of fatalistic nature of this theory that we're doomed to repeat this cycle, it's sort of nice to have some hope for a coming high in the midst of a crisis. As a millennial, though, I feel it's my job to continue being cynical and only cautiously optimistic despite running a channel focused on discussing the future. Let me know, does this all make sense now? Are you more confused and annoyed with generational?
Okay, so hopefully that clarifies a little bit more about how generations are defined. So raising a family. So again, women after World War II, the emphasis was on child raising or the role of the mother, full-time homemaker, stay-at-home moms. And like it says here, the number of working women increased, part-time jobs to achieve a middle-class income. So you start to see, during this era, you start to see more women leaving the house and getting jobs, essentially. And this was actually from a 1950s high school home economics textbook, and these were just rules for how to be a good housewife. So you can kind of see here, there's some do's and don'ts. So these were just basically general expectations for, being a stay-at-home mom or a housewife during that era. So I think things have changed probably since that. But so this leads us into the golden age of television. So TV became a popular family activity during the 1950s. 46 million households owned a television during this time, so TVs really started to become very common in the house. Television advertising influenced consumers' habits. TV dinners start to become popular. They called them TV dinners because you could basically just, eat it in front of the TV, and then you start to see the rise of popular television shows and, movie stars and things of that nature. So, TV during this era, most households only had one TV, not like today where most houses have more than one TV. Obviously a lot of times you could look at today and say, well, things have sort of transitioned with phones because you guys watch a lot of stuff on your phone. So, but regardless, the family would kind of gather around the television. So these are just some popular shows at the time. The Three Stooges, I don't know if you guys have ever seen that. The Honeymooners, I Love Lucy. These were the major stars. Pop culture, fictional rebels became popular. Young teenagers found meaning in literature and films that featured discontented youth. The Catcher in the Rye was a popular novel by J.D. Salinger. Kind of glorified juvenile delinquency, antisocial behavior by the young. Rebel Without a Cause, starring James Dean and Natalie Wood, was also a popular movie. And believe it or not, it's kind of an interesting aspect of this era, which was this is sort of when you see the rise of teenagers. Now, I know what you're thinking. Teenagers have been around since people have been around. Human beings have been around, right? And you're right. But teenagers were never seen as their own demographic. It was always like kids and adults. That was it. And so what you start to see here is this rise in this sort of demographic known as teenagers, obviously in between little kids and adults. And you start to see that become more of a distinct sort of, like I said, demographic. So the Coasters, popular band. Rock and roll obviously became big in the 1950s. This music reworked rhythm and blues and combined blues music with more energetic rhythms. Rock and roll musicians included Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino. Down here we have Aretha Franklin. So, there was a new style of music. Rock and roll is a new style of music that emerged and became very popular, especially with young people. So there's Elvis. Jailhouse Rock was his first, kind of big hit. I don't know if you guys know this, but Elvis actually served in the military. He got drafted, and, he was famous at the time, and so he was seen as sort of like a recruiting tool. Elvis was popular, so it's like, hey, people look up to Elvis. He joined the military. Maybe you should join the military, like that type of thing. Elvis, this was later on in his career. He went through a series of evolutions in his look, his appearance. He died relatively young. He was only in his 40s when he died. That's his tombstone. That's actually kind of a popular conspiracy, is that Elvis lives. I remember, even when I was a kid, there'd be Elvis sightings. And, as people would say, he didn't die. He faked his death to escape the prison of being a celebrity, because he said being a celebrity was actually very lonely because you felt isolated. You couldn't go out in public. You couldn't go to the store. You couldn't just go outside and walk around. And you'd be mobbed by fans and things like that. So, I've heard a number of celebrities say that. Some celebrities have lookalikes like Justin Bieber and, people like that, so they can kind of use them as a diversion and get out of their house unnoticed and things like that. So, and even it's kind of crazy. There's still Elvis impersonators, in Vegas and places like that. There's shows where people, dress up like Elvis. So it's probably one of the biggest celebrities of all time, I would say. Johnny Cash also was getting big at this time. They called him the Man in Black. He said, I wear black for the poor and the beaten down. Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, Elvis, and Johnny Cash all performed together kind of before they all got famous. Okay, and so as I had mentioned earlier, you're going to start to see some of the early stages of the civil rights movement occurring during the 1950s. And so the NAACP played a large role in the promotion of civil rights and equality. Like it says here, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is an African-American civil rights organization in the United States formed in 1909. Its mission is to ensure the political, educational, social, and economic equality of rights of all persons and to eliminate racial hatred and racial discrimination. So you're going to start to see them sort of emerge as a more prominent leading organization in the U.S. throughout the 1950s, and then especially, like I said, during the 1960s, the civil rights movement's really going to gain a lot of momentum. And so Brown versus Board of Education in 1896, the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson established the legality of separate but equal schools. So essentially, this Supreme Court case said you can have separate schools, but they must be equal. So when Brown versus Board of Education came into play, like it says here, this was another Supreme Court case that came later on, and it overruled or overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling, and it essentially desegregated schools. Like it says here, basically this Brown versus Board of Ed decision says reversing a decision. Linda Brown was the Brown versus Board of Ed, was an African-American student from Topeka, Kansas, who wanted to attend a white school right next to her home. The NAACP and Thurgood Marshall argued on Brown's behalf. Chief Justice Earl Warren declared racial segregation was illegal in public schools. So essentially, this guy Thurgood Marshall, he was a lawyer, and then eventually he'll become a Supreme Court justice. But he played a large role in getting the Plessy versus Ferguson case overturned, essentially. And so, it went the whole way to the Supreme Court. So showdown in Little Rock, so another landmark event of the civil rights movement. School segregation moved slow in the South. The Little Rock School Board was the first in the South to announce that it would comply with the Brown versus Board of Education decision. In September of 1957, 9 African-American students planned on attending this school. And so the governor of Arkansas ordered the Arkansas National Guard to the school. So the National Guard is kind of like the state army. So obviously we have a national federal army, but the states also have their own smaller, armies, and that's considered the National Guard. So he calls in the National Guard to prevent the students from entering the school. For nearly 3 weeks, members of the National Guard prevented those kids from going into the school. So on September 25th, 1957, the president intervenes. Obviously he knows about what's going on there, so he kind of overrides the governor, and like it says here, under the order of President Eisenhower, the Little Rock Nine, with the protection of 1,000 federal troops, finally entered the high school. So President Eisenhower called in the federal army, the federal military, the national military, to sort of override what the governor and the National Guard were sort of doing there in Little Rock. And so the federal troops made sure that the kids could get into the school. So some people were protesting this, but it was another victory for civil rights. The Montgomery bus boycott, most of you have probably heard about this, but a boycott began. So the NAACP also fought segregation in the Southern transportation system. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was an African-American seamstress who refused to give up her seat to a white passenger and was arrested as a result. So essentially, she was supposed to sit in the back of the bus. She said, no, I'm not giving up my seat. So she, basically stayed where she was. And as a result, she gets arrested for refusing to abide by that rule. A leader emerges, so Rosa Parks' arrest eventually led to her conviction for violating the city's segregation laws. The Montgomery Improvement Association, also known as the MIA, was a group of local civil rights leaders, persuaded the community to continue the boycott while the NAACP and Parks appealed her conviction. So the MIA organized a boycott where people refused to ride the public bus system. And so the MIA chose a guy you may have heard of named Martin Luther King Jr., a 26-year-old Baptist minister, as the spokesman who helped hold the African-American community together as the bus boycott dragged on. MLK pledged nonviolence to support his civil rights movement. So, when people boycotted the bus system, the city was losing a lot of money because they make a lot of money off of public transport. And so, this was a good way to sort of fight that injustice in a nonviolent way. So MLK's whole philosophy, and we're going to get into this a lot when we get to the civil rights movement, but we'll talk more about it later, but his whole philosophy was nonviolent protests. And, it would prove to be highly effective. And I'm not going to get into it too much now because, like I said, we're going to talk about that when we get to civil rights more. But this was sort of when MLK, like it says here, sort of came onto the scene, and people started to kind of hear his name and, sort of recognize him as a major civil rights leader, and he would become the primary leader of the civil rights movement. And then, eventually Malcolm X would come along, and there'd be a little bit of a difference of opinion there. But again, we'll talk about that later on. But MLK to this day is still sort of seen as the primary leader of the civil rights movement. So the boycott succeeds. In November 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the Alabama segregation laws illegal. The civil rights movement gained a new leader in MLK, and again, he would lead that movement for the next decade or so. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 made it a crime to prevent qualified persons from voting. It also set a commission to investigate violations of that law. So again, you're seeing, basically civil rights emerging and people's, civil and personal rights being upheld. And, there was a movement forward as far as equality and fair treatment in the U.S. So beyond black and white, Felix Longoria was a U.S. World War II veteran who died during the war. His body returned to his hometown, Three Rivers, Texas, and the funeral home refused to give him a funeral because he was a Mexican-American. President Lyndon B. Johnson, who again, we'll talk more about him later, but this kind of skips ahead a little bit, arranged for Longoria to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, which is a huge honor. This led to the formation of the American GI Forum, which dedicated to the protecting rights of Hispanic veterans, received help from the League of United Latin American Citizens. So again, we're seeing a positive movement in the right direction as far as equality and civil rights. Asian immigration, 1952, Congress repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. Asian Americans achieved great success but still face discrimination. So again, this is just sort of addressing, sort of inequalities and civil rights abuses that were occurring and the progress that was being made in those areas. And I just thought this was kind of funny, just seeing if you guys are paying attention. So the relocation of American Indians. Termination was the movement to get rid of the reservation system. So Native Americans were forced onto reservations. You guys probably learned about that in US 1. So there was a movement to get rid of those. The government promoted assimilation of American Indians, meaning like to assimilate or help them to just become part of the greater American culture, I suppose. President Eisenhower said he would not support that without their consent. So he says, we're not getting rid of the reservations, because he saw it as a way for them to preserve their culture. And he said that he didn't feel like it was right to sort of just get rid of that unless they said that that's what they wanted. So that didn't really follow through. Questioning conformity. Ralph Ellison wrote a book called The Invisible Man, 1952, about African Americans' search for their place in society. The Beats were a small but influential group of writers and poets who wrote as they lived, spur of the moment, without planning. Jack Kerouac was one of the most prominent Beats, wrote a book called On the Road. It was a big cultural hit. Said, we got to go and never stop till we get there. And most of you have probably never heard of the Beats, but they're kind of an interesting group that emerged in the 1950s. They were sort of like the counterculture of the 1950s. They sort of rejected the mainstream. And believe it or not, most of you have probably heard of the hippies of the 1960s, so Woodstock and all that kind of stuff. The Beats were sort of like the precursor to the hippies. So they kind of were, they were like the hippies before the hippies really became like a thing. So kind of an interesting group. We might check them out a little bit more later on. So those are the Beats. They would hang out in coffee shops and read poetry and play music and things like that. So, but like I said, sort of like outside of the mainstream of the era. The Non-Affluent Society stated that the rural poor and rural residents, particularly farmers, represented the poorest of the American population at the time. In urban communities, poor rural workers sought the city for a better life. In 1960, 20 million city dwellers lived in poverty, and there was an urban renewal movement to improve inner city housing through the federal government. So the government started to provide money to try and renovate buildings and just sort of clean up the city and fix things and things of that nature. So there was a movement to try that really kind of started to pick up to try and help people who were living in poverty across the country. Buildings like this were fixed up, so you still kind of see this going on today. Peaburg's actually had a lot of renovation. Easton has too.